Raise your hand if you or anyone you know has exposure to any of these hot upcoming IPOs. I'm not talking about employees here. I'm talking about normal retail investors who have bought pre-IPO shares. If that's you, I'd imagine you're absolutely ecstatic right now, since you're sitting on like 20x gains in a few short years. But recently, I came across this tweet which says, when she hears you have exposure to SpaceX ahead of the IPO, but it's a triple layered SPV that you paid 20% upfront and 30% carried interest without knowing who ultimately owns the shares. So when I saw that, that made me pause and I was like, are things not as rosy as they seem here? Well, folks, I'm Kevin. I'm the curious retail investor, and I really went down a rabbit hole with this topic. And the more I dug, the more my emotions went from, man, I'm happy for you, to, oh my God, you might have gotten absolutely screwed here. Not by SpaceX or Elon per se, but by the system itself that's designed to extract value from retail investors before you even realize it. Because here's the thing, what you actually own in these deals is probably not what you think. And when these IPOs finally launch, people are going to find out the hard way. So if you have exposure, know someone who does, or have ever considered this sort of thing, then you got to watch this video, because what I found is quietly one of the most predatory structures out there, and I don't think enough people are talking about it. Okay, but before we get into all the nitty-gritty, first we got to talk about how we even got to this point. So back in the day, companies would pursue an IPO after about 4 to 5 years. But these days, companies often wait 10 plus years. So the point here is that the bulk of the value creation is now happening in the pre-IPO phase. And by the time they IPO, most of the gains are gone. Consider this, right? Like SpaceX is IPOing at roughly 1.75 trillion valuation. Back in the day, Microsoft IPO'd at $500 million. You heard me right, that's 500 million. So there was a lot more room for growth. Not only that, if you want to get into any of these hot companies pre-IPO, you have to be an accredited investor and have a pretty high salary and potentially pass some tests as well. So most of retail does not qualify. But of course, retail is desperate for access to these generational companies. So what could they do about it? Well, Wall Street saw the opportunity and they took it. You know, like the front door to these deals were locked to retail, so brokers and promoters built a back door. And what they did was they found some ways to source shares from early employees or investors. They would pool those shares together and sell access downstream to retail investors. The vehicle they used was called SPVs, or special purpose vehicles. And basically, those would pool together funds from a lot of different smaller investors and use it to buy a single position, usually shares in a startup. Now, SPVs aren't new. They've been around for decades, but they're typically used by sophisticated investors who have a legal team, due diligence folks, and can read and understand a 50-page operating agreement. But, when the retail FOMO broke out, the brokers used it to give retail access to these deals, but retail didn't necessarily have the know-how to evaluate them. But either way, it worked because retail finally got the access they wanted, and this opened the door for them. So it's a win-win, right? Well, here's what nobody is telling you about any of this. So before we get into the catch here, I want to stress that none of this is theoretical, right? Like, look at this. This is just a snapshot of some of the SpaceX SPVs out there, and there's even more than this. And Linkdo, once a popular pre-IPO investing platform, filed for bankruptcy, and quote, an internal investigation uncovered evidence that Linkdo customers never owned the securities they thought they did. And here's just their website, private market investing platform. You got access to space, quantum, AI. It's a platform offering early access to private tech companies before IPO, and they went bankrupt. Also, there was a case where there was a recent indictment in New York where someone was slinging out Anduril SPVs that did not have access to Anduril, and the guy was just pocketing the cash. He was indicted and arrested. Now, that is a case of outright fraud. Not everything is as brazen as that, but you're about to see what other tricks they come up with in these types of deals and SPVs and platforms. Also, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but someone wrote, how many investors in America think they own a chunk of SpaceX when they're actually funding their ex-roommate's boyfriend's coke habit in Miami, right? And FINRA recently flagged issues and effective practices relating to private placements. So point is, this isn't fear-mongering. A lot of these problems are already happening, and they arguably are just going to get worse in the future. Now, on to the catch for these types of pre-IPO deals. First and foremost, the math is a lot worse than you think. So even when there's not outright fraud, there are a ton of fees. Like there's transaction fees, brokerage fees, management fees, carried interest, and that's just all for one SPV. Because the issue is there are multi-layered SPVs. Like you buy into SPV, that buys into another one, which finally owns the actual assets. But this is just a two-layer SPV. In this Anthropic investment opportunity, you see that they use a third layer SPV. And this person puts it perfectly. Don't ever let me catch you investing in a third layer SPV. I don't care how great the returns in. It's a con, you're the mark, and you're gonna bleed out on fees. And here's a good analogy. Picture multiple extension cords daisy chained together to reach an electrical outlet. Only in this case, each cord charges fees, and the fees really start to add up. Remember, each SPV has their own fees, and they're layered on top of each other. So if you do the math, for example, 3 layers of carry, you could end up with just 57% of what you'd otherwise receive from the company itself. So that's crazy, right? And this is an exaggeration. Like Destiny is a publicly registered fund with full SEC disclosures, so you can go look up their reports yourself. And they said that they have 5 underlying SPVs, each with additional layers underneath. So this is completely normal and often the case that you're getting multiple layered SPVs rather than just a single clean one. Now, that's not all. Oftentimes, you are paying a significant premium to the most recent private round. So that's not good, of course. And then also for different platforms, they have different prices. So price discovery is completely broken. So point is, like, even if your IPO pops hard, your actual return may be a fraction of what you're expecting. Now, I know some of y'all are saying, okay, but I still get exposure, right? So if something goes up 5x, I'm still in the profit. Well, hold up there, because the fee issue is actually only one part of the problem. And what comes next is arguably way shadier. So the issue is you may not own what you think you own. Now, it may not come as a surprise that you don't actually own shares, right? You own units in a fund that may or may not own the shares. That fund may sit behind other funds like we've already seen, but oftentimes you can only see the entity that's directly above you. Of course, you shouldn't expect to get any voting rights, information rights, anti-dilution protection, nor liquidation preference. That's kind of common sense. And most deals are forward purchase agreements, which is a contractual right to buy shares later. Someone wrote this like, the most fortunate investors will receive a fraction of what they think they'll receive, and the rest will only receive a lesson on the difficulty of enforcing a forward contract. So watch out for this. Forward contracts are notoriously difficult to enforce. Also, on top of that, these IPO companies have aggressive right of first refusal. They can block, buy back, or unwind transfers retroactively. Also, you're oftentimes at the mercy of your SPV's manager. They hold all the power. They can give you cash instead of shares, which might not be the end of the world, but they can also extend the holding period beyond the typical lockup. So you may be waiting quite a long time. This guy writes that this Kirkland and Ellis, a famous law firm, is going to have $1 trillion in bookings unwinding the 5,000 50-layer SPVs that have been slung onto this thing over the last decade. And he writes that there's $1 billion fee class action lawsuit waiting for all the guys who bought these forward contracts, and will soon find out the shares never existed at all. So yeah, those people would be getting absolutely screwed. And then when the IPO finally happens, it's going to be a verification event where a lot of people are going to find out what the fine print actually meant. Now, I want to take a step back after doing all this research and going down this rabbit hole and share my takeaways. First of all, not every SPV is a complete scam, right? There is a spectrum. There are some decent ones that could be okay if they're single layer, validated, low fees, and fully documented, right? But when there's complexity that's used to hide stuff that's bad for retail investors, that's when there's potential for abuse. Also, this should come as no surprise because this is ultimately what happens when the best companies in the world stay private for 10 plus years. Like retail demand was overwhelming, so people created a pressure valve. And it's just unfortunate that that pressure valve primarily benefits the people who built it and offered it rather than the people who bought it. So the SpaceX upcoming IPO will be the first public stress test of the system. And depending on your entry and your details, you might have just been better off buying post-IPO. Also, if you're already in one of these, be sure to ask your SPV managers all the hard questions, and I pray good luck that they'll give you good news rather than bad news. But also, if you're considering buying one of these in the futures, just go for a good one. Otherwise, if there's any doubt, just wait for public listing instead. Well, folks, I hope you like this kind of investigative analysis content. If you do, please give me your hype points if you don't mind. It's only on the YouTube mobile app, and you have to swipe right on this card and click the hype button. Basically, it's a way to give newer channels like this one some more exposure. So I would greatly appreciate if you could help me out there. Just pull out your YouTube mobile app. It only takes a second. Also, if you're interested in this current topic, you gotta watch this video next about how all these mega IPOs may drain the liquidity from the market and cause a broader market top.